BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, I will be looking at the flight path that D.B. Cooper used before his epic jump, responding to the live stream from Eric Eulis, looking at some comments from the D.B. Cooper Sleuth channel, and of course continuing with the Cooper Profile segment, which talks all about the psychological profiling of skyjackers. And this one will share a story of a female skyjacker. So there's a lot to go through on this episode of Cooper Friday. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. I've wanted to make an episode on the flight path for quite some time, but I'm going to be very honest with you guys. Most of what I talk about on Black Box Online Radio relates to serial killers, criminal psychology, as well as understanding certain motives and actions within human behavior. So looking at something in regards to the flight path is some new territory for me, but at the same time, I was very curious about this because some D.B. Cooper sleuths create their entire theories and their entire understanding of the case based on the flight path. And I do indeed mean that because they expect that the conventional flight path that was used by D.B. Cooper has to be inaccurate, and then they tie this into their understanding of the case. To help us out, we're going to go over to the D.B. Cooper forums and just have the most basic introduction, and this is all going to start after D.B. Cooper has landed in Seattle. D.B. Cooper starts in Portland, he hijacks the plane, he lands in Seattle, he demands $200,000 and 4 parachutes, then the flight takes off, and this is the most basic introduction. V-23 Airway. Victor 23 is the airway Flight 305 took most of the way down to Reno, and Cooper didn't request a specific flight path. D.B. Cooper said that he wanted to go from Seattle to Mexico, but they told him they didn't have enough fuel to fly to Mexico or that plane couldn't hold enough fuel, so they agreed on a stopover point, and that was Reno, Nevada. And they would have gone down Victor 23 all the way to Reno. But let's keep going here. Flight 305 left Seattle and headed south on Victor 23 and stayed on Victor 23 all the way to Toledo, Washington. The flight moved slightly westward prior to turning at Ed Carlson Memorial Field. Flight 305 took off from Seattle-Tacoma Airport at approximately 7:36 p.m. on November 24th of 1971. That is 64 nautical miles. After 64 nautical miles, a turn was made at Toledo, passing the Malay intersection, and the flight arrived at this location at 7:59 p.m. As the plane passed the Malay intersection, it stayed on the east side of Victor 23 down to Lake Merwin. The plane went by Lake Merwin at approximately 8:10 p.m. The plane then went near Battlegrounds, Washington, where it is believed that Cooper jumped out. He jumped somewhere near Merwin Lake or somewhere near Orchards. The time frames for the jump would be between 8:10 and 8:15 p.m. And I've seen other people try to estimate the time of Cooper's jump at exactly 8:12, 8:13, 8:14. If you just watch a handful of D.B. Cooper videos on YouTube, you might see something to that effect. So it seems like that. Let's just go back to this thing and from the very, very beginning. The flight takes off at 7:36, and then Cooper jumps at approximately 8:10. I mean, they were going pretty slowly, though, because D.B. Cooper did request that he wanted them to fly at 10,000 feet with the flaps down, the landing gear down, and, of course, the depressurized cabin, because Cooper knew that he was going to jump. And this is going to be a point of contention, because some of you guys in the comments section are simply saying, there's no reason to talk about these alternative flight path theories. The flight path is documented. Everything that I just read to you, that's certifiable. This is where the plane was. It's all just accounted for. So anybody who's pushing an alternative flight path theory should be mostly dismissed. And as I said, I watched a recent live stream from Eric Eulis where, firstly, he is talking about doing a new ground search in the state of Washington, and that will be happening later this month to anybody who's listening to this as it's coming out live. This is August of 2025. But also that he was talking about some possibilities, and I'm just going to go through the major possibilities of people who disagree with the conventional narrative. They believe that the FBI has put out misinformation in regards to the flight path, or at the very least, the flight path was not truly followed, and anything about it being documented is somewhat of an urban myth. And on Eric Eulis's live stream, he was proposing that the pilots wanted to fly to Reno. They didn't have any other passengers other than Cooper. I mean, there's the crew. Of course, Tina Mucklow is still on the plane, but Cooper is the only real passenger. They didn't have to follow any specific flight path. And a big piece of evidence that Eric Eulis uses for this is the money find at Tina Bar. In 1980, the $6,000 were found at Tina Bar by the Ingrams. So what he is proposing is that D.B. Cooper actually would have jumped in a completely different location than everything I read to you, talking about Battleground Orchards and Lake Merwin. D.B. Cooper would have actually landed and touched down southeast of Tina Bar, in the farmland southeast of Tina Bar, and then his choice to after he landed was that he had to hide the money. He had to do something to secure the money in a location where he could come back for it later. Because if he's just in the middle of farmland in Washington state, he has to get to civilization for a proper getaway. So what does he do? He goes to a place where he doesn't think anyone would find the money. He's going to bury it in the ground, and then he goes perhaps to Portland or another neighboring city. He comes back to Tina Bar later at night and takes the money that he buried, and 3 bundles of the money stayed behind at Tina Bar, and that was what was found in 1980. That would mean that the money stayed in the ground for 9 years, 1971 to 1980, approximately 9 years that it was in the ground. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have a lot of opinions about that and a lot of interpretations of that evidence. But please let me know what you think about that. I have one major point of contention with this. There is one major issue that I would like to bring up, and it's not even so much about the flight path. It's just that hiding the money at Tina Bar in that scenario would be extremely impractical. It would be extremely risky. You're telling me that Mr. D.B. Cooper so-and-so would have landed southeast of Tina Bar in farmland, and he can't find any better place than to hide the money near a riverbank? Now, D.B. Cooper was smart. I don't think Cooper was just some dumb guy that got lucky. I think that D.B. Cooper was smart. And if he's going to bury the money at Tina Bar as a hiding place to come back to it later, has he not heard of flooding? Has he not heard of rain? I mean, all kinds of things could have disturbed the money, brought it to the surface. Somebody else could have found it, even within 24 hours. I mean, just countless ways that could have gone wrong. And you might be thinking, well, even in 24 hours, one day, that really isn't the biggest risk in the world. Maybe, fair enough, but there would be so many better places to hide $200,000 and the briefcase and maybe the parachute than near Tina Bar. It's just, you're adding an additional layer of risk if you're going to bury the money that close to the water. And I would really just love to know what you think. Do you think that that is adding an additional layer of risk to have the money buried so close to a riverbank when there is going to be land all around you? You would just need some place that is perhaps between 2 trees or something, and that would be a more suitable location, someplace on dry land as opposed to right next to a river. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. And I told you guys that I was going to talk about some more alternative theories involving the flight path, but first I would like to look at an article from HistoryNet.com that is going to tell us more about what D.B. Cooper was experiencing when he was in the air. After daylight gave way to darkness, a radio call went out. Tower, Northwest 305 is ready for taxi. As is typical for a late November, a fierce storm was off nearby in the Pacific Ocean that was pummeling westward toward Washington that night. Huddled in the cockpit was Captain William Scott, who was in constant radio contact with both the air traffic controllers and company headquarters in Minneapolis. Cooper was not privy to this dialogue, but it was probably distracted co-pilot William Radicek. It was his turn to fly this segment. Victor 23 is an imaginary pathway in the sky plied by airliners between Seattle and Portland. Rather than the normal steep climb into the serene atmosphere above, Radicek disengaged the autopilot and hand flew the big Boeing trijet southward through the low-hanging storm clouds, intermittent precipitation, and constant crosswinds gusting to 45 miles per hour. Shortly after takeoff, Tina Mucklow was ordered to extinguish the cabin lights and close the first-class curtain and go to the cockpit and stay there. That is being ordered by D.B. Cooper, mind you. The two exchanged a final friendly wave, Cooper and Tina, as she pulled the first-class curtain shut. Cooper was never seen again. Indicator lights in the cockpit signaled that the aft door and the ventral stairway were unlatched. At 8:12 p.m., the crew sensed a subtle airframe shudder, accompanied by a change in the cabin pressure, suggesting that Cooper had jumped. So that is more or less what D.B. Cooper is doing just prior to his descent into the night over the Pacific Northwest. Some people don't even believe that he jumped over Washington State. They actually believe that he jumped much closer to Oregon. But this is the next alternative theory. You heard that line about how Bill Radicek is manually flying the plane, there's no autopilot. Some people believe that the pilots made the decision to deviate from Victor 23 because they wanted to put Cooper in a rougher spot. I mean, Ryan Burns talks about this all the time. If D.B. Cooper jumped from Victor 23 in the expected drop zone, he would have landed in relatively safe and light terrain. I mean, they're just wide open spaces that would have been on the ground. This is hardly something that would have killed him if he had been able to pull the chute. Mike Davis said it the best. If D.B. Cooper pulled the chute, he would have lived. I mean, pulled the cord for the parachute, he would have lived. He would have survived. The urban myth about D.B. Cooper not surviving the jump would heavily be challenged. So what the pilots may have been thinking is, we're going to fly over some very rough terrain, mountains, forests, maybe even the Columbia River, something that would put D.B. Cooper in a rougher patch. I have one major challenge to that the pilots are trying to sabotage D.B. Cooper. How did they know that D.B. Cooper was going to jump during that leg of the journey? What indicators did they have that D.B. Cooper was going to jump over Washington State or even Northern Oregon? Because D.B. Cooper told them that he was going to go to Mexico. D.B. Cooper said that he wanted to fly to Mexico. They agreed on the stopover in Reno. How did they know he was going to use the parachutes on the first leg of the journey? Everything else that he said indicated that he was going to use them after they had landed in Reno and refueled. I mean, maybe they just thought, this is the only concession that I will give. You know what, we're just going to take precautions. This guy has parachutes. He ordered Tina into the cockpit. Clearly, he's about ready to jump. But that means that they would have had to have had some very subtle deviations if they thought of the plan that quickly. So I think that, that is just purely an assumption. I mean, it's an assumption that the pilots secretly deviated from the flight path in an undocumented way because they were trying to sabotage Cooper's jump. I mean, if anything, they probably would have just flown to Reno because that's what they were instructed to do. They were complying with that. And they just didn't know that Cooper was going to jump at that exact specific time. So, I mean, you guys can challenge me on that in the comments section. I would love to read what you guys think. Which one do you agree with? Do you think that it's likely that they thought Cooper was going to jump shortly after takeoff? Or do you think they genuinely thought that Cooper wanted to jump over Mexican airspace? I'm genuinely asking that. I want to know your feedback. Put it in the comments section down below. Now, in addition to Eric Eulis's proposition that there was a deviation from the flight path, I've talked about one other thing about how the pilots are trying to sabotage Cooper. These are two things involving the flight path. And the third is not as extreme as what Eric Eulis stated. It is that D.B. Cooper didn't land southeast of Tina Bar. It's that he actually landed at Tina Bar. And D.B. Cooper buried the money himself to mark and commemorate the drop zone as a signature That's another one. And I mean, if anything, like, I can comprehend all of those things. I just think that, I mean, you just have to kind of have a certain set of beliefs in place for that one to actually work. But that would mean that DB Cooper isn't burying the money at Tina Bar for any practical purpose. I think that Tina Bar would be a horrible place to bury money if you're actually trying to use it later on in your criminal expenditures. But then there should be one fourth one. We also have to have one fourth one. I just have to mention this very briefly, and that is that there's a DB Cooper suspect out there named Walter Recca, and they are maybe the loudest voices about this. The proponents of the theory involving Walter Recca say that exactly what I told you at the beginning, that the pilots deviated from the flight path, that they wanted to throw Cooper off course. They were just using the flight path that was not documented. They didn't stay on Victor 23 at all. They actually went 100 miles to the east, and then Cooper ended up in Clay Elum, Washington. Okay? Well, I mean, I certainly don't agree with that, and I don't think there's any evidence to support that. But I told you for this episode that I was also going to talk about the new Q&A session that was on the DB Cooper Sleuth channel, which is run by Ryan Burns. And this was a fairly good episode. It was one of his shorter live streams. But it seemed like Ryan Burns was actually giving some credence and some credibility to the theory that D.B. Cooper was Canadian. Somebody asked him about this directly, and I have a standalone episode on the possibility of D.B. Cooper being a Canadian. I think it's just called D.B. Cooper was Canadian ? Or something wonderful like that. But this is something that I was very hesitant to accept in the past. But it seemed like, I mean, it's almost sounded very similar to what Pat Brown was talking about in her psychological profile about how, just hear this scenario. D.B. Cooper crosses the border from Vancouver into Washington. We're talking about Vancouver, Canada, into Washington State in the United States. This Canadian citizen, D.B. Cooper, was going to get on the plane in Portland. They fly to Seattle. Then he gets the parachutes and the money, and his whole plan is to jump very soon so he can get back across the Canadian border. Maybe puts on a disguise, does something to alter his appearance, just tries to pass off his parachute as a backpack or something like that, and he crosses the Canadian border with the $200,000, and he stays in Canada for the rest of his life. Okay. The supporting points for that would be that, number one, Dan Cooper was the name that D.B. Cooper used when he was on the plane, or to buy the ticket he gave the name Dan Cooper. He is called D.B. Cooper by the media. We call him D.B. Cooper, I think, because it just has a better ring to it, and there's something a little bit unique about it, even though D.B. Cooper was a real person. But somebody who was Canadian would be more likely to be familiar with the Dan Cooper comics, which were about a skydiver, but they were only available in the French language at the time. Canada is, of course, a bilingual country, especially in Quebec, but I mean, like, people are very bilingual. I don't even want to get into all the specifics, because some people are like, no, Quebec has only one official language, New Brunswick is the only bilingual province. Okay, you're right, I will give that to you. They speak French in Canada. Let's just leave it at that. So someone who was Canadian would be more likely to be familiar with Dan Cooper. The second point would be that Cooper asked for negotiable American currency. And this is something that just would sound very, very odd, because why would an American say that as opposed to $200,000, $200,000? Also a fair point. And that maybe Cooper was not caught, as Ryan brought up, and this is something that is very, very new for our discussions here on Cooper Friday, because the FBI did not have the same rights in Canada that they did in the United States. We're talking about different jurisdictions, different governments. They couldn't just go through like records and so on, because they didn't have the same authority in Canada as they did in the United States. And Ryan even brought up an example about how they were trying to look at bank records of an individual, and that they were denied because they did not have the jurisdiction. It wasn't their jurisdiction. They didn't have the right to make those types of investigations in Canada. Okay, so all of that ties into a possible Canadian Cooper, and this idea has also been discussed by Jude Morrow, who's the author of the book Dan Cooper, And as I said, Pat Brown was really taking this to the bank for a completely different reason, which I still don't agree with, mind you, but she said that D.B. Cooper didn't wear gloves on the plane because he knew that he had never been fingerprinted, so his prints wouldn't show up in any type of system. I mean, I'm still not in agreement with that, but I think one of the reasons why I was so turned off from that particular theory at the very beginning was because Pat Brown can be very arrogant, she can be very condescending, and as my fiance said when I was watching the Cooper live stream that Pat Brown had done, she said, "Why does that woman talk like she's always on drugs?" And my simple response was, "What do you mean, like she's on drugs? I don't know if she's on drugs or not. That's her business. Maybe she is. Maybe she's just high all the time." And I mean, yes, she does have a very awkward presentation style. And I thought that her whole Canadian scenario was just absolutely far out and ridiculous. But as time goes by, I can comprehend the reasons a little bit more and things start to make sense. And the reason why I'm talking to you about this now is because I had somewhat of a reversal when I was watching her. When I was watching her stream, I was just thinking, okay, this is my biggest problem with the Canadian Cooper. Cooper starts out in Portland, goes to Seattle, and then is flying south again. They're saying that he wants to go to Canada. He's flying in the exact opposite direction. He's flying in the wrong direction. Wouldn't it have made sense if Cooper crossed the Canadian border, boarded a flight from Seattle to a different location, and then flew back north? I mean, he didn't have to fly between Seattle and Portland. He could have started in Seattle, flown to anywhere in the United States, then just got on any type of northbound flight going to any city that was closer to the Canadian border, if that was his goal. But ultimately, I had the reversal for the following reason. Just thinking that that would be too obvious. That would just give it everything away that, oh, well, he's flying to the Canadian border, then very clearly he's trying to cross the Canadian border, and then that would open up more possibilities for investigations. By starting in Portland, flying to Seattle, then flying toward Reno, it creates a little bit more of a mystery. And I told you guys, I think that Cooper was smart. Cooper was a smart guy. He was not just some dumb person that threw this all together. But what do you think about my reversal on the possibility of a Canadian Cooper? Do you think that Cooper was Canadian or American? Do you think that the negotiable American currency is a giveaway? Do you think that Dan Cooper is a giveaway? I would love to know what you guys think. Share anything you want about the flight path and anything you want about the Canadian Cooper. And right now, I would like to enter the segment on Cooper Friday called the Cooper Profile, where I talk to you guys about the psychological profiling of skyjackers, mostly looking at the book The Skyjacker by Dr. David G. Hubbard. Because in the mid-20th century, there was an explosion of these types of crimes, but skyjacking was something relatively new because of the advances in aviation. So David G. Hubbard really wanted to try and document as much information as he could about skyjackers and their behaviors, how were they thinking, what were their life experiences like, and we finally get to the story of a female skyjacker, and her name was Gladys. Gladys was somebody who didn't do it by herself. She had a male partner, and it's almost as if they had this type of Bonnie and Clyde thing going on. Absolutely, he was the driving force, but she was a participant in a skyjacking, and yes, this is one of the stories that is going to involve the frequent skyjackings with Cuba. But she actually shared some experiences that were rather similar to a lot of the other skyjackers that I've talked to you guys about in this segment. I often begin the Cooper profile by saying that almost all of the early discussions were talking about a male who had an alcoholic father and an overly religious mother, but already I found several exceptions that go against that type of rule. With Gladys, she definitely had an alcoholic father, an abusive father, but neither one of her parents were very religious. Her father was a Catholic, but her mother was a Unitarian, but they weren't very strong practitioners of their faith. And I think that this is just very telling. I have to reiterate this point. It's just these psychological patterns are not just formulas. It's not just if somebody has an alcoholic father and a religious mother, they go on to be a skyjacker. And it's also that, oh, if somebody is a skyjacker, it doesn't mean that they had to have had an alcoholic father and a religious mother. It's just some similarities you'll see. You might see like correlations and scatter plots pointing in particular directions, but overall, she's about halfway there. And the stories, of abuse in Gladys's life were actually very, very tragic and saddening. It starts out with she's talking about how her father was an alcoholic, and he would get very drunk and just start throwing stuff. He wouldn't hit people, but he would just throw the items all around the home. She's like, no, but he never hit anyone. Oh, wait, but he hit me. But, he never hit my mom. Oh, wait, and he was very violent to my brother, but he didn't hit my mom. So it's just so interesting about how people can compartmentalize their traumatic experiences, where it goes from, he didn't hit anyone, okay, well, he hit me, he hit my brother, but he didn't hit my mom, about how she would interpret that as not hitting anyone. But, the abuse does not stop there with physical abuse. At first, there is actually a lot of abuse that comes from her brother, because Gladys develops a very close relationship with the father, even though there is this type of physical abuse. It seems like he prefers his daughter over his son, like daddy's little girl, so to speak. So her brother would do very abusive things to her, and when the parents were at home, he would pull a kitchen knife on her and say, I'm not really your brother, and threaten to stab her, and abuse of that sort. She didn't elaborate on any further details in the book The Skyjacker. But then, you have a different element that takes place, and this just absolutely shocked me, because as I said, Gladys seems to have somewhat of a compassionate relationship with her father, and, he would sit next to her on the couch and they would fall asleep together, and she would put her head on his shoulder, and I'm thinking, okay, well, this guy wasn't perfect, but it seems like he's still trying to bond with his daughter. Then, with the very next sentence, part of me just died. And I was like, oh no, because that's how things started. She used to sleep next to him on the sofa, then the sexual abuse began. And I'm not going to elaborate on the details. He did not grape her, but everything else, every other type of physical and sexual abuse occurred. And their parents divorced when she was 13. The abuse started when she was 9, so there were at least 9 years of regular abuse that took place. Gladys was also somebody who was a very poor student in school, because she also said something very interesting, and that is that kindergarten was not a good experience for her. Because when you go to school, they have your body, but they don't have your mind. It's just like prison. Like, when you're sitting in class and you start staring out the window, your mind is not really there. They have your body, but they don't have your mind. And I was like, I know we're dealing with some very, very tragic experiences here, but that's still a pretty cool statement. Gladys seemed like someone who was very thoughtful, very intelligent, very emotionally aware, but also a victim of terrible abuse. After her parents divorced, at age 13, she was indeed raped by somebody while she was walking to school, so the abuse just doesn't seem to end. And I'm not faulting her for the next part, but why she was, after she was a victim of that terrible, terrible incident, she developed a promiscuous lifestyle. That does tend to happen with victims of that type of abuse. Again, I'm just stating this because it was in the book, not trying to victim blame or shame or anything. So then Gladys stops her promiscuity when she meets her boyfriend, and he is somewhat of a radical. Part of me wanted to describe him as the typical bad boy image with the ripped denim and the leather jacket and so on, but he is somewhat of a radical thinker, and it's his idea to do the skyjacking, to skyjack a plane that's going to Cuba, but she seems to go along with it because she just thinks that they have nothing there. They have nothing in America. Skyjack a plane, go to Cuba. Other people did it, and that's the foundation of the skyjacking. So my immediate takeaways from this are, there was a lot of abuse that drove her away. There were a lot of issues that were going on with her mental state, even to the point where she just felt like she had no love in America. And this was almost a case of societal suicide, because Societal suicide is when somebody commits a crime. They know they're going to get arrested. They just hate their life so much that they don't want to kill themselves, but they don't want to participate in society. So they do something that gets them sent to prison. And it's the details of her sentencing weren't completely clear in the book, but skyjacking was punished very severely, as it should be, because they needed to deter people from committing these skyjackings. And she even refers to prison as almost like going to purgatory. And that's what triggered the societal suicide censors in my mind, that it seems like, okay, she almost set herself up for failure by being involved with this plan because she just wanted to be free from her traumatic life. And I don't think that that is a far out statement. Some other things about Gladys that are a little bit different than the other skyjackers. She regularly had dreams about flying when she was a kid, and I've said this on the Cooper profile a lot, that Dr. David G. Hubbard really likes to get into the interpretation of dreams. It seems like he was a very Freudian psychiatrist, and Freud was a lot of into the interpretation of dreams. But she's talking about how she would have frequent dreams where she was flying, and she would fly all around the world. But sometimes in her dreams, she would land, and then a monster would come for her, and she starts to try to fly away, and she would just be trapped. So she had dreams where she was flying, and she also had dreams where she was paralyzed. And I said, from last week's episode, I really didn't have a lot of dreams where I was flying as a kid, but all through my life, I have had frequent dreams where I was paralyzed, not like every single night or even once a year, but I've had very vivid dreams where I was paralyzed, like where I was trying to do something and I just couldn't move. And that is a big commonality among these skyjackers, the dreams of paralysis. And prior to reading the book The Skyjacker, I would have just told you that dreams don't really have a lot of metaphorical meanings or significant meanings or symbological meanings. You have dreams because they're distracting your body while you're trying to sleep. So just like the neurons in your brain are firing to create some type of image, sometimes it actually is counterproductive and it wakes you up. Like if you have a nightmare. But also, certain things can be triggering dreams. Like, you must have heard that thing about how your olfactory sense is connected to the part of your brain that produces dreams. So one way to avoid nightmares is actually by providing your nose with beautiful scents that you can smell. Having a certain familiar and comfortable scent in your bedroom is a way to prevent nightmares. It's not a perfect science, but I mean, some people will say that that is a remedy. I have not really tried that too much, but I'm definitely thinking about trying it more in the future. And I don't know if dreams are going to be the biggest window into the mind of skyjackers or the biggest window into the world of D.B. Cooper. What was D.B. Cooper dreaming about? Well, according to Dr. David G. Hubbard, D.B. Cooper would have had dreams mostly where he was falling, where he was paralyzed. His dreams would have been very bleak. He would not have experienced a lot of joy and contentment. He may have had a lot of dysfunction in his life. He may have experienced certain problems that could have been associated with substance abuse in the past, particularly alcohol. But D.B. Cooper would have perhaps broken out of the alcoholic mode to a certain extent. But overall, though, I mean, those are just some possible observations, and that is one thing, though, that I've really had to deal with in terms of profiling. It is something that is just so open-ended, and it's really hard to pinpoint what actually happened. All right, that is a reasonable possibility, but is it what Cooper was actually doing? So that's why I was so harsh on Pat Brown when I did the psychological profiling episode, responding to her claims about Cooper, because I was like, I think I even said, that's not a psychological profile, you just created one scenario. But over time, though, I think that she may have been on to a few things. But what do you think about any of the things that have been discussed in this episode? What do you think about the flight path? What do you think about the Canadian Cooper? And what do you think about the story of Gladys, the female skyjacker? I must say that, in conclusion, in regards to the female skyjacker, Gladys, it seems to me that she was just heavily influenced by her boyfriend, and she never would have committed the skyjacking or have been a participant or accomplice in a skyjacking going to Cuba if this boyfriend with the ripped jeans and the cool jacket didn't poison her mind with his radical thinking. And to be clear, he didn't actually poison her mind. She openly said She was apolitical, she was apathetic to all of that stuff. She did it because she was in love with him. She does state that very clearly in the book, The Skyjacker, but I think that he was just the driving influence on that. So this really goes to show that a female skyjacker is going to be somewhat different. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And Black Box Online Radio comes to you Monday through Friday, sometimes bonus episodes on the weekend. And on Mondays, I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer. On Tuesdays, about JonBenet Ramsey. On Wednesdays, about Jack the Ripper. And now on Thursdays, about the Black Dahlia murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947. And right now, you are listening to Cooper Friday here on BBOR. And I release shorts and reels Monday through Friday as well on Instagram. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now, and I will see you guys tomorrow for a bonus episode. I will be doing a bonus episode on the disappearance of Amy Bradley. That is one case that was recommended to me by multiple people. They requested just to hear a different perspective on the disappearance of Amy Bradley. Brand new material for the channel, but I'll be sharing all of my observations on that case tomorrow. And if you're listening to this in the future, feel free to check out my episode on the disappearance of Amy Bradley. That's all for me now, and until next time.